You were never really family, dear. Just a woman my son felt sorry for. Do us both a favor and be gone by Friday. That's what my mother-in-law said to me 9 days after my husband's funeral. 11 months later, she sat across a conference table from me, needing my signature to keep her own house. My name is Diane Holloway. I was 31 years old when my husband Richard died, and this is the story of the 11 months between that sentence and that signature. I met Richard Holloway at a financial conference, of all places, 6 years before any of this happened. I was a distressed debt analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, the kind of unglamorous financial work where you spend your days pricing the debts of companies already circling a drain. He was heir to Holloway Group, a real estate and development company his grandfather built, and he was, against every assumption I'd made about wealthy families before I met his, genuinely kind. He'd wandered into the wrong breakout session by accident, one about distressed municipal debt, and ended up sitting next to me purely because it was the only open seat left. He asked, afterward, whether I'd explain what half the panel had actually meant, and I remember being surprised that a man who could have simply nodded along and left, never admitting his confusion, instead asked, plainly, like understanding mattered more to him than appearing impressive. We talked for 2 hours in that hotel lobby afterward. I married him 18 months later in a small ceremony his mother made her disapproval of unmistakably clear throughout, though never in words specific enough to actually object to out loud. His mother, Margaret, never once let me forget where I'd come from. Not his father, who'd passed years earlier. Just Margaret and Richard's older brother Trevor, who ran the family business alongside her and inherited, I think, every ounce of her particular talent for making you feel small using only the gentlest possible language. There was a specific holiday dinner, maybe 2 years into our marriage, when Margaret asked me, in front of the entire extended family, whether I'd considered scaling back the analyst work now that I didn't really need to worry about that sort of thing anymore. I told her I enjoyed my work considerably, independent of any financial need. She smiled the way she always did, the smile that communicated she'd expected exactly that answer and found it faintly amusing rather than persuasive. Richard squeezed my hand under the table, the same quiet apology he offered almost every time his mother spoke to me that way, which was more often than either of us ever fully acknowledged out loud. Richard died of a sudden cardiac event at 41 on an ordinary Tuesday. I want to tell you honestly that I have very few clear memories of the 2 weeks after that. Grief does something to time I still don't fully have words for. What I do remember, with total clarity, is the 9th day. I remember standing at the funeral itself, 9 days that felt like 9 minutes and 9 years simultaneously, watching Margaret accept condolences with a composure I found almost admirable, even through my own grief. Trevor delivered a eulogy that mentioned me exactly once, in a single sentence about Richard's devoted marriage, a phrase so carefully generic it could have applied to almost anyone. Margaret and Trevor came to the house Richard and I had lived in for 4 years, the house his grandfather had actually built, with a document they called the Revised Will, notarized just 8 months before Richard's death, naming Trevor sole executor and primary beneficiary of the entire Holloway estate. I wasn't mentioned in it at all. Not the house, not the modest joint accounts, nothing. You were never really family, dear, Margaret told me, standing in my own living room, holding a box she'd apparently prepared in advance for my belongings. Just a woman my son felt sorry for. Do us both a favor and be gone by Friday. I asked her as steadily as I could manage where the original will was, the one Richard and I had discussed openly for years, the one that left the house to me and a portion of his shares in trust for both of us equally. Wills get updated, Diane, Trevor said, not quite meeting my eyes. People's priorities change. Richard clearly reconsidered things near the end. Richard and I discussed our estate plan 2 months before he died, I told him. He didn't mention reconsidering anything. Then perhaps, Margaret said with a small, tight smile, he simply didn't feel the need to discuss it with you. Then at that Friday, into a small rented apartment, carrying 4 boxes and a folder of financial documents I'd kept meticulously throughout our marriage, out of professional habit more than suspicion. The apartment was small enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor's television through the ceiling most evenings, a detail that felt, some nights, like a strange kind of mercy, something ordinary and unremarkable to focus on besides the size of what I'd just lost. I spent that first week mostly sitting with boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, telling myself I simply needed time before figuring out what came next. It was going through that folder 3 weeks later that I found the first inconsistency. Richard's signature on the revised will was notarized on a date I could prove. To his own travel records, he'd spent entirely in another state at a conference I'd helped him prepare for myself. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at nearly 1 in the morning, cross-referencing the notarization date against a flight itinerary I'd booked for him myself 8 months earlier, still saved in an old email folder out of the same professional habit that kept me organizing everything else in my life. I checked it 4 separate times, hoping each time I'd find I'd made an error somewhere. I hadn't. Richard had been 1,100 miles away, standing at a podium giving a presentation I'd helped him rehearse. On the exact date, a notary in this city claimed to have witnessed him signing away his entire estate. I want to tell you what I felt, sitting at my kitchen table with that discovery in front of me. Not triumph, something colder and more clarifying than that. I understood in that exact moment that the will was forged, and I understood almost as quickly that proving it in court against a family with the Holloway name's resources was a fight I was going to lose. I consulted an estate attorney the following week, a careful, sympathetic man who told me, honestly, exactly what I already suspected. Contesting a notarized will required overturning a legal presumption of validity, an expensive, years-long process against a family that could outspend me on legal fees for a decade without noticing the cost. He walked me through, patiently, exactly what that kind of litigation actually looks like from the inside. Depositions, competing expert witnesses on notary procedure, appeals that could stretch a straightforward case into a 5-year ordeal, all while the Holloway family continued controlling every asset in dispute the entire time. I've seen families win cases like this, he told me. I've also seen the winning family spend more in legal fees than the estate was ultimately worth. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you both possibilities plainly. You have a strong case, he told me. You also have considerably less money than the people you'd be fighting. I sat with that assessment for almost a week before I made the decision that actually changed everything. I wasn't going to fight the Holloways in a courtroom where their name and their resources would decide the outcome regardless of the truth. I spent most of that week doing exactly what my professional training had taught me to do with any bad debt situation, separating what I actually wanted from what simply felt satisfying to want. What I wanted wasn't a courtroom victory that might arrive, if I was lucky, in 5 years after both of us had spent a fortune proving what I already knew. What I wanted was the actual house, the actual shares, and Margaret and Trevor understanding clearly exactly how badly they'd misjudged who they were dealing with. A courtroom could get me maybe one of those things. Slowly. I started to suspect there might be a faster way to get all three. I was going to become the single most important person in their financial life instead, using the one skill nobody in that family had ever bothered to ask me about. I want to explain something about Holloway Group that Margaret and Trevor spent years hiding behind marble lobbies in a respected family name. The company was drowning in debt. Richard had mentioned it to me once, vaguely, years earlier. Trevor's aggressive expansion into commercial properties right before a downturn. Loans taken against buildings that hadn't performed the way projections promised. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, I thought of almost nothing else. I reached out to a distressed debt specialist named Renata Ford, someone I'd worked alongside years earlier, who now ran her own small acquisition fund. I didn't tell her everything at first. I simply asked whether she'd help me research and acquire specific categories of commercial and private debt, the Rochelle entity, with my identity kept entirely separate from the transactions. Renata and I had worked together briefly years before Richard on a portfolio of defaulted retail leases nobody else in the office wanted to touch. She'd left the firm to start her own fund not long after, and I'd followed her career from a distance ever since, admiring the specific patience she brought to work most people found tedious or unglamorous. I trusted her instincts before I ever explained my actual reasons for calling. This is either an incredible investment opportunity, she said, looking over my initial research, or deeply personal. Possibly both. Both, I told her. Does that change your rate? She smiled. It changes how much I enjoy the work, not the rate. We formed a holding company called Corvus Capital Partners, structured carefully enough that even a determined search would take considerable effort to connect it back to me. Over the following 7 months, Corvus quietly acquired 3 separate categories of Holloway debt. The first was a defaulted commercial mortgage on an underperforming office building Trevor had personally guaranteed. purchased at a steep discount from a regional bank eager to clear it off their books. The second was a revolving credit line Holloway Group used for ongoing operations, purchased from a private lender restructuring its own portfolio. The third, and most personally satisfying to acquire, was a private loan Trevor had taken against his own shares in the family business to cover gambling debts Margaret apparently didn't know about yet. Renata handled every direct negotiation, careful never to let any counterparty connect the acquisitions to a single coordinated buyer, let alone to me specifically. I spent most evenings during those 7 months poring over Holloway Group's public filings and industry reports, building a complete picture of exactly how fragile the company's finances actually were beneath the marble lobbies and the respected family name. Work that felt, some nights, uncomfortably close to grief itself. Learning, piece by piece, exactly how much Richard's family had been hiding, possibly even from him. By month 5, Corvus Capital held enough of Holloway Group's total debt structure that any meaningful refinancing decision would require our cooperation, whether the family realized whose cooperation they were actually asking for or not. There was a moment during month 6 that I want to tell you about, because it's the point where the power dynamic between the Holloways and me actually started to shift, though only one of us understood it yet. Trevor attended an industry mixer where Renata, representing Corvus publicly on my behalf, had arranged to be introduced to him. I watched from across the room, close enough to hear most of the conversation, far enough that he had no idea who I actually was standing near. I remember the specific strange sensation of watching him work a room exactly the way he always had, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his family's finances had already shifted considerably more than he understood. Corvus has been remarkably aggressive lately, Trevor said, trying in that specific way powerful men do to sound casually curious rather than concerned. Should I be worried about your fund's interest in my company's paper? I'd say that depends entirely on how well your company's paper performs, Renata told him, perfectly pleasant. Corvus tends to take a very active interest in companies it believes are underperforming their potential. And if I wanted to know who's actually behind Corvus, he asked, and I caught, even from a distance, the small, practiced smile he used on people he assumed he could charm into disclosure. Our investors value their privacy, Renata said. I'm sure a family as private as yours can appreciate that particular preference. I watched his smile falter just slightly at the word family. He didn't push further that night. But I understood, watching his face during that exchange, that some instinct in him had already registered something was circling closer than he wanted to examine directly. 7th month brought exactly the situation Renata and I had been quietly engineering toward. A balloon payment on the commercial mortgage came due. One Holloway Group couldn't cover without either refinancing or selling assets at a loss during a soft market. Trevor's office reached out to Corvus requesting a restructuring meeting. I told Renata I wanted to attend that meeting myself, in person, for the first time since we'd started this entire campaign. Are you certain? She asked. Once you walk into that room, there's no version of this where they don't know exactly who's been circling them for 7 months. That's precisely the point, I told her. I didn't spend 7 months building this so I could stay anonymous forever. The meeting took place in a downtown conference room, Trevor and Margaret on one side of the table with their attorney, Gerald Finch, a man who'd represented the Holloway family for over 20 years and had, I would soon discover, personally handled considerably more than routine estate paperwork for them. I remember the specific weight of the folder Renata carried into that room, thick with 7 months of acquisition documentation, and the strange calm that had settled over me somewhere during the elevator ride up. The same clarifying cold I'd first felt at my kitchen table discovering that forged notarization date. I'd rehearsed almost nothing for this meeting. I found I didn't need to. Every sentence I was about to say had been true for months already. I walked in last, Renata beside me, and watched Margaret's face rearrange itself in real time as she recognized me. Diane, she said, the practiced warmth entirely gone from her voice. What exactly is this? This, I said, taking a seat directly across from her, is Corvus Capital Partners currently holding 61% of Holloway Group's total outstanding debt. Here to discuss the restructuring terms your company urgently requested. Trevor's face had gone the specific pale I imagine mine went 9 months earlier, sitting in his mother's living room being handed a box for my belongings. This is absurd, he said. You don't have the resources for something like this. I had considerably more resources than your family ever bothered learning about, I told him. You were so certain a woman you considered a charity case couldn't possibly matter financially that nobody thought to check. You did this out of spite, Margaret said, her voice tight. I did this out of arithmetic, I told her. Spite would have been contesting a forged will in court and losing slowly for years at enormous expense. This was simply better math. Shivik's composure cracked, just slightly, at the word forged. I don't know what you think you know, she said. I know Richard's signature on that revised will was notarized on a date his own travel records place him in another state entirely, I said. I've known for nearly a year. I simply decided a courtroom wasn't the most efficient place to make that particular argument. Gerald Finch, who had been silent throughout most of this exchange, shifted slightly in his chair, a small movement I noticed and, I would later learn, meant considerably more than I understood in that moment. And, regardless of any of that, Trevor said, recovering some of his usual confidence, you're still just a creditor. You have leverage over our debt structure. That doesn't give you the company, and it certainly doesn't give you back a house you have no legal claim to. You're right, I said. As of this morning, leverage over your debt structure gives me the ability to call the mortgage on the family estate itself, since your own attorney structured that loan against the property directly 3 years ago, to fund Holloway Group's expansion. Trevor looked at Finch sharply, as if expecting him to contradict me. Finch said nothing, which told Trevor everything he needed to know before I said another word. I watched something in Margaret's face collapse entirely at that sentence. The house. Her house. The one she'd stood in 9 months earlier, telling me to be gone by Friday. You wouldn't, she said. I would, I told her. Unless we can agree on terms considerably more reasonable than the ones your family offered me 9 months ago. Here is the twist I didn't see coming. The one that actually mattered more than anything Renata and I had engineered over 7 careful months. Gerald Finch cleared his throat and said quietly, before this goes any further, I need to say something. On the record with everyone in this room as witnesses. Margaret's head turned toward him sharply. Gerald, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, he said. Mrs. Holloway asked me to prepare that revised will 8 months before Richard's death, backdating the notarization to make it appear routine. I did it. I've regretted it for nearly a year. And I'm not prepared to commit further fraud today by staying silent while Diane negotiates leverage against the family that's now discovered exactly how much documentation actually exists proving the truth. The room went completely silent. I watched Trevor's face and then Margaret's, cycling through the same rapid, horrified recalculation I imagined my own face had gone through 9 months earlier, discovering a forged signature at my kitchen table. There's something else, Finch said, reaching into his briefcase. Richard came to my office 4 months before he died. Not about the will you're all discussing. About a different one. His actual current will, filed independently, which he asked me to hold separately from the family's usual estate paperwork, specifically because he'd started to suspect his mother and brother might attempt exactly what they eventually did. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. This names Diane Holloway primary beneficiary of Richard's personal estate, including his shares in Holloway Group and the house. He signed it himself, in my office, 11 months before his death. I've been sitting on it, terrified of what disclosing it would cost me professionally. I decided that cost is considerably smaller than the one I'll pay for hiding it any longer. I sat in that conference room, holding a document I never knew existed that named me the rightful heir to almost everything Margaret and Trevor had spent 9 months insisting I'd never had any claim to at all. I read it twice before I fully trusted my own eyes. Richard's handwriting was in the margins of one page, a small note to Gerald about which of his grandfather's original property parcels he specifically wanted protected in trust rather than sold, a level of quiet, deliberate care that felt, in that moment, like hearing his voice again for the first time since the funeral. He'd been thinking about protecting me months before either of us had any reason to believe protection would be necessary. I hadn't spent 7 months building Corva's capital because I knew this envelope existed. I built it because I assumed I'd never see a version of justice that didn't require me to earn it myself, debt by debt, entirely from scratch. Finding out Richard had already tried to protect me, quietly, months before his death, without ever telling me directly, was the one piece of the story I never planned for and never saw coming. Margaret didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the woman who'd stood in my living room with a box prepared for my belongings. "What do you want, Diane?" she asked. "I want the truth on record," I told her. "I want Holloway Group restructured under terms that keep it solvent, because I have no interest in destroying something Richard's grandfather actually built honestly. And I want you and Trevor to understand clearly that the woman you decided wasn't really family was the only person in this room who ever actually protected what was left of it." The restructuring itself took another 2 months to finalize, considerably less dramatic than the conference room confrontation that preceded it. Extended payment terms on the mortgage, a debt-to-equity conversion on the revolving credit line that gave Corvus a controlling stake in Holloway Group's ongoing operations, and a formal transfer of Richard's original shares to me, uncontested this time, backed by Gerald Finch's own testimony about the authentic will. I insisted on keeping enough of the company intact that the handful of longtime employees who'd worked there since Richard's grandfather's era kept their jobs. Some parts of what that family built were worth preserving, even from the people who'd nearly destroyed it themselves. Trevor was charged 3 months later with forgery and estate fraud, based largely on Gerald Finch's testimony and documentation. He avoided prison through a plea agreement that stripped him of his remaining shares in Holloway Group. Shares that came, under the restructuring terms, directly to me as majority creditor and rightful heir combined. I attended the sentencing hearing mostly out of a need to see the process through to its actual conclusion, rather than any specific desire to watch Trevor suffer. He didn't look at me once the entire proceeding. I found I didn't need him to. The version of myself that had once needed acknowledgement from that family had mostly finished existing somewhere around the 7th month of building Corvus Capital, replaced by someone considerably more interested in outcomes than in being seen. Margaret didn't go to prison. I didn't push for that, honestly, though I understood why some people in my life thought I should have. She lost the house within the year regardless, once the numbers made clear that keeping it required capital she no longer controlled. She lives, now, in a modest condominium an hour outside the city, and we have not spoken since that conference room. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that she'd told a version of this story to her remaining friends that framed herself as the wronged party, a woman betrayed by an ungrateful daughter-in-law she'd generously welcomed into the family. I'm not surprised by that. I don't think Margaret is capable of telling this story any other way, even now, even to herself, alone, in a condominium considerably smaller than the house she once told me to be gone from by Friday. I kept Holloway Group running, restructured, smaller than it once was, but genuinely stable for the first time in years. I named Renata Ford Chief Financial Officer within the first 6 months. Gerald Finch, to my own surprise, still works with the company in a limited advisory capacity. The specific arrangement I offered him once I understood exactly how much his final decision in that conference room had actually cost him personally, and how much courage it had taken him to make it anyway, after 20 years of silence. I asked him once, months later, why he'd finally chosen that exact moment to come forward, after 2 decades of protecting the family's secrets far more serious than a single forged will. He told me he'd spent 20 years telling himself loyalty to a family and loyalty to the truth were the same thing, and that watching me lay out 7 months of meticulous, patient documentation in that conference room had been the first time in his career he'd been forced to actually see the difference clearly, in real time, with no way left to look away from it. I think about that whole 11 months often, and what it actually taught me. Not that money solves grief, because it doesn't, not even slightly. What it taught me was that power built on assumption, the assumption that a quiet woman with an unglamorous financial job couldn't possibly matter, is exactly the kind of power that collapses fastest once someone finally bothers to do the actual arithmetic. I think, too, about how differently this story might have gone if I'd simply accepted Margaret's box that first Friday and quietly disappeared from the Holloway family's life entirely, the way I think she genuinely expected me to. Some part of her, I believe, never seriously considered the alternative, because in her experience, people without money or a recognizable name simply didn't have the tools to fight back in any way that mattered. That assumption was the single largest miscalculation of her life, and she never once saw it coming, right up until the exact moment I sat down across that conference table. If you've ever been told you weren't really family, weren't really important, weren't really a threat worth taking seriously, by people who mistook your quietness for weakness, I understand that particular underestimation better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for answering it. I only know that the version of justice that actually lasts tends to be built patiently, with real leverage, rather than shouted loudly in a room that's already decided not to listen. I know too that not everyone has 7 months, or a background in distressed debt, or a Renata Ford willing to help build a shell company on nothing but trust. I don't want to pretend this particular path is available to everyone reading their own version of Margaret's box packed for their belongings. What I do think is available to almost anyone is the underlying instinct, the decision to stop trying to win an argument in a room stacked against you, and to spend that same energy instead building something the room eventually can't ignore. Richard tried to protect me the only way he could, quietly in an attorney's office, months before he ever imagined he'd need to. I like to think he'd recognize the rest of what I built afterward as exactly the kind of quiet, deliberate persistence he fell in love with in the first place. Tabik, thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a time someone underestimated exactly what you are capable of building, patiently while they weren't paying attention, I'd love to hear about it. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.